I'm Jen Taylor Skinner, and this is the Electorette. On this episode, I have a conversation with Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez. Cristina is running for the Senate to represent Texas. And if her name sounds familiar, you may remember my interview with Cristina on this podcast in the early days of the Electorette. I had her on to talk about her organization, JOLT. JOLT's mission is to lift up the voices of the large Latino population in Texas. And since then, JOLT has become one of the most powerful and influential political forces in that state. The Senate seat that Cristina is running for is one of the most critical races in Texas that will help flip the state blue. This is a really important race. Texas is also a Super Tuesday state, and that means that their primary is on March 3rd, 2020, and that's just around the corner. Cristina and I discuss the issues that are most important to Texas. We discuss the national implications for flipping this seat blue. We also discuss what it's like to be on the campaign trail as a progressive Latina woman in Texas. So here is my conversation with Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez. Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Glad to be here.
You were one of my very first guests with the Electorette, I think in 2017, the very first year. And I talked to you because you had an organization called JOLT in Texas, which was to register voters, Latino voters in Texas. Is that still going on, JOLT?
Yeah, JOLT is up and running across the state and quickly become one of the most important political forces in Texas that's lifted up the voice and vote of thousands of Latinos across the state.
Oh, that's amazing. So what made you decide to run for the Senate?
So I wasn't looking to run for the Senate. Texas has changed a lot in the last few years, and some of the state's most important progressive leaders and folks that helped run Beto O'Rourke's Senate race, I guess we're in a meeting back in April and recognize that the state is very close to flipping. But for us to get over that last hump to flip the state, that we have to drive up voter turnout amongst young people and Latinos. And I'm one of the folks that's done the best job of that in our state. And so they asked me to run for U.S. Senate, also because of my policy background, working on raising wages and making jobs safer at my first organization, Workers' Defense Project, and also tackling issues like student debt and climate change. And based on that resume, they thought that I would be a good fit to run for U.S. Senate. And at first I told them no, and they kept calling me. And, I thought no because I felt like the really wrong time for me personally. I have a 2-year-old little boy named Santi at home that I raised primarily by myself. And I went on a long walk after they kept calling me because I live for changing the politics of Texas. And they were really convincing me that this was the best way to influence the political outcome on the progressive issues that I care about. And so anyway, I went on this long walk and I thought, yes, it's totally the wrong time for me personally. But it was also the wrong time for me personally when I was 24 years old and I launched my first nonprofit called Workers' Defense Project. And it was the wrong time for me personally when I was 6 months pregnant the week after the 2016 election. And I launched JOLT. So I thought, yes, it's the wrong time for me personally, but maybe it's the right time in Texas history for a progressive Latina to become our next senator. So I threw my hat into the ring and here we are.
Wow, that's really great. That's a really great story. I mean, I'm just thinking about, because I have a new baby at home
Congratulations.
too. So I understand. Thank you. And I'm always thinking about that. Like I talk to women like you and they're all at different stages of their political careers and they all have really good advice. I remember I was talking to someone last year who was running in the November elections and she said something to the effect of, you're more ready than you think you are. Mm-hmm. And so we always think that we're not ready. So I love hearing stories like yours. So, congratulations.
Thanks.
It must feel really, I don't know, does it feel heavy to have so many people relying on you saying, you're the one, we think you can do this? Like, what does that feel like?
I think after being at JOLT and working across the state to have young people, especially young Latinos, see that they were this tremendous political force, I realized that so much of the reason why it was hard for people to believe that was because they didn't see anybody in power that reflected their stories, their experiences, that looked like them, that came from their backgrounds. And so every day that I wake up, I think about what a gift and what a responsibility this is to be running, that I want to be everyone's senator in Texas. And I also want to uplift the stories and communities that often haven't been reflected in what story gets told about Texas. So, there is always some piece of you that wonders, is this actually what I should be doing? And then there's another part of you that realizes that this is the right moment, this is the right time. And if we're not the ones to seize it, then who will? And so that really keeps me going and focused on why I'm doing this and who I'm doing it for and what it means to many, many people across my state.
So what story is told about Texas that you think is incorrect or needs some correction, like the narrative about Texas?
Well, I think when people think of Texas, they think of a state that's pretty monolithic, actually. They think of cowboys and barbecue, and there's great barbecue and great cowboys in Texas, to be sure. But our state is actually incredibly diverse. When I want people to think of Texas, I want people to think of the Anthony Bourdain episode where he goes to Houston, Texas, which is one of the most diverse cities in America. And he goes to a quinceañera and is there with a Latino family. He goes into a Vietnamese community, into African refugee communities to meet with African American communities. And then goes and eats barbecue. And it's just this beautiful reflection of who Texas is. That's the Texas that I see. And that is really who we are as a state. And that 1 in 3 Texans are like me. We are immigrants or children of immigrants. I think so much of who Texas is today is who the rest of the country will become. And I think it's a beautiful, diverse place that I want to uplift and for other people to see.
Wow, that's really beautiful. I have to go back and watch that episode.
It's one of the best.
Yeah, I have to watch it. It's funny because you were talking about Beto O'Rourke, right? And what people are thinking about the state of Texas and the possibility of it flipping. So I was just looking at those numbers. And first of all, I just want to point out that your primary field is huge, right? There are lots of people running in this primary for the seat, right? That's one thing. So maybe they have the same idea that this is a great time to try to, get involved in flipping Texas. But the second thing, a lot of the analysis says that there is a Beto effect here. And I think in 2019, Ted Cruz won by a little over, just slightly a hair over 50%. And Beto O'Rourke brought in 48%. But that was a 5 percentage point improvement over Clinton, because I think Trump won Texas by 52% and Clinton lost with 43%. I mean, is that what people are looking at?
Yeah. So, just in the last few years, we've seen a huge uptick in voter participation. What you have to remember about Texas, people have said have been a long time a red state. And while it's true that we've gone Republican, we've more than anything been a non-voting state. We've had one of the lowest voter turnouts, and that's how Republicans have held power in Texas. They have been happy to win without a mandate, but with a minority of voters participating. And now, because that's changing, we're starting to see that Texas, who our future leaders will be, will likely change and likely happen in 2020. We are one of the youngest states in the country. We're a majority people of color, and those young people and people of color and progressive white folks are voting like never before in Texas. And I think with Trump on the ballot, you're going to see a massive wave of Latino voter turnout in Texas, because half of all those turning 18 in the state are Latino, and they are voting decidedly for progressive candidates.
So why do you think that is? I mean, why do you think that you have low voter turnout in Texas? Because I know that states that do have low voter turnout, the story is different for each one. There's always some voter suppression, especially in the states that have, high populations of people of color, right? And, I always dismiss the idea that apathy is a big part of it. Like, what do you think it is with Texas?
Well, you look at the states that have lower voter turnout. A lot of them are going to be states where people are working many hours. In Texas, we actually work more hours than most people in other states. We have people in power that have made it increasingly difficult to register to vote and to vote. And that ends up getting reflected in who actually goes to the polls. And now, though, that is changing. And it's changing because also Democrats are taking control over the big metro areas in our state, which is where the majority of the state's population lives, and they're making it easier and more accessible to vote. So a place like in Houston, which is Harris County, they're now extending hours to where you can vote and making sure you can vote anywhere in the county, that you don't have to just vote at your precinct or your local polling station. And that's changing the outcome of elections.
Right. I would imagine that the makeup of Texas and the industries that are in Texas would make something like that more useful. Because I think about where I live. I live in Seattle and Washington, where the tech industry is big. People have a lot more flexibility in their schedules, right?
Mm-hmm.
With the tech industry. But yet here in Seattle and, across the state of Washington, we have vote by mail. I mean, it's great. great. But, there are other states that need it, probably more so than we do, but it's really great. So I'm glad to see that you're moving in that direction.
Well, we're moving in at the county level. I get asked all the time, what's going to be my number one policy issue when I go to Washington? And for a state of 29 million people, I believe we can have a multi-issue agenda that's going to be some of the top priorities for our state and the country. But the number one thing we have to do is change the rules of democracy. Right now, we have people in power like Mitch McConnell and John Cornyn, who I am running against, who I believe have greater interest in serving their donors than the American people. And so we need to make sure that we not only overturn Citizens United, but I want us to come to a place where our elections are publicly financed, where we have not opt-in voter registration, but opt-out, so that every single American citizen that is eligible to vote should be easily able to do so. And the last thing I want us to do is make Election Day a national federal holiday so that we can truly celebrate our democracy and country, because real democracy, in my mind, has always been a radical idea, even from when our country was founded and we only extended the vote to white land-owning men. It was a radical idea even then to say just they alone would decide who represented the country, that there would be no kings, that there would be no one above the law. And we've come a long way to extending the vote and franchise to communities of color, to women, and we still have a long way to go. And real democracy will always be a radical idea, and I think it's something that we should celebrate, making National Election Day a federal holiday.
That would be excellent. So I'm just curious about, being a woman and running in Texas and what the gender dynamics are like there in Texas. We made a lot of strides since 2016. We have a historic number of women in the House. So, but what is it like there in Texas for you running?
As a woman, I have a distinct advantage actually in a Democratic primary. Women are more likely to get elected. In the general election, I imagine that from the other side, especially from the likes of John Cornyn, the Republican Party, that are completely terrified of losing Texas because of what that would mean for the entire party nationally, that they will play every single sexist and racist and xenophobic trick imaginable. And I'll confront all of those as a woman, a Latina, and a child of immigrants. For me, what I really see is in this process what it's like running as a mom, that while men who decide to run for political office are thanked for their sacrifice for being away from their family and children, mothers are made out to be like not good family members, not good for their children. We are not thanked, rather we are demonized for our sacrifice. And for me on the campaign too, because I'm not independently wealthy and women are less independently wealthy than men, it means we've had to rethink how this campaign functions for me as a mom, about how my son travels with me on the road, about how we build in nap time when we're traveling places, because the political process was not set up for someone like me.
Yeah. So what are some of the other issues that voters care about in Texas?
So as I travel across the state, there's definitely been some key issues that resonate across geography, across income and ethnicity and race. So one of those has been gun safety. And, in Texas, we've experienced some of the most mass deadly shootings. Look at what happened in El Paso a few months ago. That is very raw and at the forefront of people's minds across our state. I graduated high school the year of the Columbine shooting. And so I, like many people across our state, have been waiting their entire adult lives to see Congress act and do very basic things like pass universal background checks and ban assault style weapons. And instead, we decided to teach a generation of children to learn how to play dead in their classrooms. Like that seemed like the more logical response to many of our politicians. And so that's an issue that I hear about all across the state. Another issue that I hear a ton about is healthcare. So Texas, we have the highest uninsured rate in the country. 1 in 6 Texans do not have healthcare. And that's not even talking about folks that have health insurance like myself, but we go to the doctor, or 2 weeks ago, my son got pneumonia and I had to take him to the hospital twice in 1 week and walked out with close to $1,000 in medical bills, and that's with health insurance.
Wow.
And so that is an issue that is on the minds and pressing for people across our state. And then the last issue I would say I hear a ton about is immigration. Families of all different kinds of backgrounds that are just disgusted and appalled by seeing children ripped from their mothers and their fathers at our border, and seeing asylum seekers that are living on the other side of the US-Mexico border who our government has refused to hear their asylum petitions, and children that are living there without running water and electricity. I just hear a tremendous amount of outrage in our state about those issues.
You talk about, having a path to citizenship for dreamers, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember, when Trump first took office and, he tried to roll back the Dreamers legislation that Obama put into place. And, we all kind of panicked. And, it just seems like a lifetime ago. I hope people haven't forgotten that this is an important part of our constituency that we need to focus on.
Yeah, and in Texas, we have the second largest dreamer population in the country. I spent a decade advocating and organizing for construction workers in Texas. In Texas, half of the people who build our schools, our homes, our office buildings do so without documentation and without protection. So I saw up close the costs of an economic system that was willing to accept undocumented workers' labor, but not their full humanity. And so for me as a Democrat running statewide in a state with one of the largest foreign-born populations, that perhaps no state has benefited more from the courage and the contributions, both culturally and economically, than immigrants in Texas, I see it as my job not to say what we're against as Democrats, but to say what we're for. And we have this massive opportunity to overhaul our entire immigration system to both protect the rights of immigrant and American workers and protect the sanctity of family. And so at the end of this month, my campaign is going to be unveiling our plan about how we build an immigration system that is modern, efficient, and meets our labor needs, but allows people to be full human beings in our country.
So also in your platform is abolishing private prisons. And I know that Texas has a pretty high incarceration rate. I was looking at the numbers, and I think it's something like about approximately 900 people for every 100,000 citizens in Texas, which outpaces the incarceration rate for the country, right? I think Texas as a whole has about 250,000 people incarcerated. Does that sound right?
Yeah, we have one of the largest incarcerated populations in the country. We were really at the forefront, especially in the 90s, of tough on crime, of lock them up and throw away the key. And we went so far to the right that you actually now have Republicans in our state that are working on criminal justice reform because we stripped our schools, our public services of needed resources to fund a racist war on drugs, to criminalize the poor and communities of color. And now we're on trying to peel that backwards. So I'm really proud. This past week, my campaign endorsed the People's Justice Guarantee that has been spearheaded in part by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, that looks at how we can overhaul our entire criminal justice system where we can keep our communities safe, but have a system that is more concerned with truth and justice than with retribution, that will fully fund mental health and public health crises like addiction for what they are instead of as criminal offenses, and look at how we look at the harm we've really done to numerous communities, especially communities of color, with the criminal justice system we built over the last 3 decades.
So if and when we flip Texas blue, it'll probably be by slim margins, right? Just assuming the way the trajectory of the most recent campaigns, right? So how do we increase those margins, in your opinion? How do we increase those margins over time to keep it blue?
Yeah, so, in Texas, obviously, we are the biggest battleground state in the country, and Republicans aren't going to let Texas go without a fight. I like to say that I know how to box outside of my weight class, so I'm ready for it. But it's going to be a real fight, and whatever dirty tricks we saw play out in Georgia and Stacey Abrams' bid to be governor, I like to say she is the governor, was elected by the majority, though they stole the election. whatever dirty tricks we saw play out in Georgia against Black voters and Democrats, I think will be just the tip of the iceberg of what we see play out in Texas in 2020. So, of course, we need to defend legally against what will happen with voter suppression, but we also have to register many more people and get many more people out to vote than we believe we need to win. I truly want to win with the majority of voters in my state casting a ballot. I want to win with a mandate. And as an organizer that long-term has been working with communities that oftentimes are an afterthought for Democrats, young people and people of color and working class communities, those people are going to be at the forefront of my campaign. I want a campaign that looks like who Texas is, and you don't do that without deep investment in those communities. So that's what we're going to be doing as soon as we get out of this primary.
So what's your advice to women who may be listening who are considering running and they're on the fence and they're not really sure?
You know, it's similar to what I launched this initiative last year called Movement Mujeres in Texas to train a generation of women of color to take on leadership positions in our state. I really do believe that change is most often driven by those that are underestimated and underrepresented, that they often are the greatest spokespeople for the change that communities need. And so many times, not only do others underestimate us, but we may underestimate ourselves. We may have self-doubt that we are the right people for this work in this moment. We may think we're underqualified. And I promise you that many men that run, not all of them, but many men that run do not feel that way, even if they are underqualified. But to know that your voice, your story, your experience, perhaps if you don't take up that space, that it will not be taken up by anyone else. And I believe democracy is strongest and at its best when it's shaped by unique, diverse interests and voices. And so take up that space, lift up your voice and lift up your experience, because it represents those of millions of people that otherwise would not be heard in our political process.
Wow. Well said. Well, Cristina Tzintzún Ramirez, thank you so much for joining me. I wish you all of the best in your campaign.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Glad to be back with you.
Thank you for listening. The Electorette is independently created and produced by me, Jen Taylor Skinner. And of course, I'm the host. But I also do all of the editing, the audio, and the graphics. You name it, it's on my plate. So if you enjoyed this episode of The Electorette, please help The Electorette grow by subscribing. Just hit the subscribe button on whatever app you use to listen to podcasts. Also leave a review for The Electorette on iTunes. Lastly, one final way to help The Electorette is by following The Electorette on social media. That's at Electorette on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep up the good fight.